Before you hand over the keys with host Anne-Marie Hayes, this is episode 6, Must-Have Discussions About Cannabis and Driving High with Sylvia Lark. Welcome back. I'm Anne-Marie Hayes, and today we're talking about drugged driving, specifically weed. And in Canada, cannabis is now legal across the country. In the United States, a lot of states are making it legal too. So this is becoming an increased concern because, of course, it's the drug of choice for most young people. So today, my expert is Sylvia Lark, who did a program called Weed Out the Risks across Canada. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that program involved and where you went with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Anne-Marie. So Weed Out the Risk is created by Springboard, which is a social service, multi-service organization in Toronto. But they've got this program that's awesome called Weed Out the Risk, which is a 1-hour workshop for students. And it educates them using harm reduction, conversations, discussions, things like that. So they're getting informed about the risks of cannabis and driving. Now, we're fortunate enough to have partnered with MAD, who has full-time staff delivering the program across Canada. And that's exactly what I did in that special year of 2018 when it was legalized in Canada. So I got to have that fun job of facilitating in September before it was legal, and then October it became legal, and how that conversation changed with youth. And their perceptions, I really got to witness how that attitude change happened in the classroom prior to legalization and after.
We do a program at Teens Learn to Drive when, restrictions are lifted and we can actually meet face to face, called the Sweet Life Roadshow. And we have a section of that that's about cannabis too. So we've talked to students all over Ontario about cannabis, and there's so much misinformation. And I guess just beginning, there's a lot of confusion because cannabis can be medical or it can get you high. But they're two different parts of the cannabis plant. So maybe talk a little bit about the difference between THC and CBD and how that works.
Yeah, it's crazy how in one plant you have such different substances. But THC is what gets someone high, and it's what people use in recreational cannabis. So they're using that with the intention of, being impaired, being high. And that CBD is the part of the cannabis plant that is for medicinal purposes. And it has a ton of great functions for people with a variety of different challenges that can range from mental health to physical health, inflammation, like all sorts of different things. And also an array of ages too. You've got kids who have a 90% reduction in seizures when they're epileptic, and they're taking THC. And then you have elderly folks who have reduced inflammation or have Parkinson's, and they're drastically helped with CBD. Now, THC isn't going to, offer much in that. The only time THC comes into the conversation of medicinal functionality is with folks who have cancer. And when they're going through chemotherapy and their appetite is suppressed with other medications or the chemotherapy, THC is known for bringing that munchies feeling, making people feel really high, which on this conversation is one of the big reasons why people drive high, because they're always wanting to grab something to eat. Before they smoke, they were like, oh, I'm fine for tonight, I'll stay in, I won't drive. And then they smoke weed and they're like,
get the munchies and gotta stop somewhere and get something to eat. Yeah.
And I'll just pop around to the corner store.
Yeah, not going far, it'll be okay. But there's a lot of misconceptions with young people when it comes to being high too, especially driving high. Young people that I've talked to who would never get in the car with someone who's been drinking have no problem getting in the car with someone who's high because they don't see it as such high risk. If somebody's been drinking, there may be stumbling, they might be slurring their words, maybe not. I mean, it depends on how much they've had to drink. But there are some real signs that somebody has been drinking. Not so much with cannabis. So talk a little bit about how it affects people and what people will see when somebody's high.
Yeah. So the way I always explain it to students is just don't judge someone on the way that they look, right? And we kind of use that phrase with a variety of things, but it really comes into play with impaired driving specifically, even with alcohol. But the funny thing about weed is that the impairments are really different. I'm not going to, pretend that, just because legally they're both charged the same, they don't visibly look the same. A high person and a drunk person do look different. And the impairments from cannabis are associated with safer driving. So, for example, being more focused, driving more slowly, being more relaxed. These are things people would associate as they're a safer driver compared to someone who's been drinking, who's rowdy and maybe aggressive or hyped up, and you can see they drive too fast. So what I have to do in my job is explain to you how those things that we see as not as dangerous, that tunnel vision, can actually be more dangerous because you're not looking at your peripheral vision.
I just want to clarify that. They feel focused. So the person who's high, other students, oh, I'm fine to drive because I'm really focused when I'm high. But it's not really focused, as you say, it's kind of tunnel vision.
Exactly. Yeah. So they have all these misconceptions in their mind where it makes them feel better than they really are, or feel more able to drive than they actually are. And that's a risky thing. And I think one of the riskiest things about cannabis is that it gives people the illusion that they're safe to drive when they're not. It gives that illusion that you're a more focused or alert driver because you're so focused on what's in front of you. The reality is when you're driving, you don't realize how much you're picking up in your periphery, and missing that could be the difference between a life and death situation, getting into an accident, and not.
Absolutely. One conversation that I remember so clearly with a student was, my dad used to smoke when he was a kid. He still smokes now. It's not a big deal. He's okay with me smoking. Now, the point I want to make is that if somebody is smoking cannabis, marijuana, whatever you want to call it today, it's quite different from the product that was available maybe 30 years ago.
So I'd actually talk about that in two ways. So one, the substance itself is very different. Cannabis has been bred. It's a plant. There's male, female, and it's literally bred to have higher potencies today than it did back in the 70s when we first saw the explosion of cannabis. So two, honestly, they're very different substances, and the fact that the potency has gone up to an average of 25 to 30% now, where it was maximum 2% in the 70s. So that's different. But also the education was so different. It makes sense that you would have parents in this, or people in the 70s smoking weed and driving because there was no conversation. There was no education. There only was imprisonment for possession. Don't do it. It's illegal. There wasn't any sort of knowledge. Why would someone know that they shouldn't drive high? Honestly, when we have all those feelings of when you're high, you feel like you're a better driver. And if you're not educated on it, it makes sense why that happened. So I would say there's two reasons, why people use that past experience. And they even use it with in a more recent context too. My friend drives high all the time, they'll say. So it must be okay. We all know that's obviously not a good way to judge safety moving forward. But yeah, that's a perception a lot of youth have.
Okay, so here's the situation. My daughter is going out tonight. Some girlfriend or a guy comes to the door to pick her up. And I kind of notice a bit of a smell, but I'm not sure. I mean, even though marijuana has a really distinct smell, but you can mask it with colognes or perfumes or whatever. How might I, what signs might I see in that person that might indicate to me that, hey, I need to ask a few more questions before my daughter leaves home?
What I would do first is, if possible, ask if he wants to come in for a drink or something like that, just to have a conversation.
Not alcoholic.
No, not alcoholic. Just water or something. But come inside and just see if you can hold a conversation with him and get him or her and get a sense of how they're cognitively doing, if they look like they're kind of able to drive. And I know you're no DRE, but you can kind of get a sense in a conversation with.
Okay. DRE is drug recognition expert. People think, with alcohol, there's a breathalyzer. If I'm high, they can't tell. And they can. And the drug recognition experts are highly trained, and we have a lot more of them now in Ontario than in Canada than we did before. So talk a bit about that maybe too.
The DRE process, it's basically an officer who goes through additional training. It's quite expensive training, actually, I recently learned. But not all officers are trained to do it. So special officers are officers who go through this special training can detect impairment from that roadside. So they look at a variety of different things. And then they'll also maybe take someone into the police station and they'll do a blood test, a saliva swab, and further examination just based off their behavior. And those are all things that will be used in court to prove impairment. But ultimately, that blood test is going to be the biggest thing.
And because we don't, sorry, I'm just going to butt in again, but because we don't have DREs, drug recognition experts, in every vehicle, often the police will start with a regular sobriety test and at the side of the road. And that will indicate whether or not there's something going on with the driver. And then they may call in a DRE if they suspect that a substance has been used.
Yeah, exactly. Which is something I always say to teens. Like, let's say they say, for example, I don't smoke weed, so I'll be the designated driver and I'll drive my friends. But my friends might be in the car smoking weed, but I wouldn't do that. And I say, okay, so what happens if a cop pulls you over because you have a taillight not working or you don't stop long enough at a stop sign, whatever reason, and the officer puts their head in and they smell the cannabis in the car, right? They're not, now you're going to have to go through that whole process, potentially going to the police station for hours. It's a complete bust of your night. Like, you could have just gone to your friends and had a good time, had you not engaged in that situation. So yeah, just, something to think about.
I suspect that there's kind of a secondhand thing too, like with cigarettes, right? I mean, people died from lung disease when they never smoked a day in their life. I'm not suggesting that people get really high, super high in a car, but it is, I mean, what do they call that? Something box, that there's a term
Hot
for it.
box.
Hot box. When people are smoking in the car and the driver can't help but to consume some of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think generally if the window's open, it shouldn't be impairing to the driver. It's secondhand high doesn't come all that easily unless it's intended. And where it's intended is where you don't have any sort of ventilation. I mean, yeah, if you're sitting in a car with windows up for 20 minutes while your friends are smoking a joint, you're probably going to get high. If you keep the windows down, it's a nice summer day. You got all four windows going. And maybe they're like just using a pipe or something like that. In a room, like, I shouldn't be talking about driving because obviously it's illegal to do that. But with a level of ventilation, it should be okay. But yeah, it obviously depends person to person as well. And it's the same with alcohol, the same way you can't have friends passing a beer between each other, even though you're not drinking. Like, you might not drink based off your values.
And even if the car is stopped, I mean, you can be in a parking lot.
Yeah.
And if you're sitting in the driver's seat and you have care and control of that vehicle, you can be charged.
Yeah, it's interesting, all the rules around how strict impaired driving is and how many ways people might think that they're kind of doing the right thing in the end, but from a legal perspective, it can catch up with them in a bad way. So, for example, there'll be students who say, okay, I'm going to sleep in my car. So my friend said I can't sleep over at their house. I've been drinking or smoking weed. I'm not going to drive home. I'm going to make the right call. I'm going to sleep in my car. And though they are trying to do the right thing, if a police officer were to come by and knock on the door and see a drunk person sitting in the front seat, at any seat in the car, they can be charged with impaired driving because they have the ability to wake up any second, say, I feel better, and put that car and drive. So it's something to be careful with when you are deciding to use substances. Just stay away from the car, or don't have the keys in the car with you. Like, you have to think about those details because from a legal perspective, if an officer comes by, how are they going to see the situation?
Yeah, and it is illegal. It's illegal to have open alcohol in a car. It's illegal to have people smoking or whatever in the car. So cars, and people make their own choices, but never mixing vehicles and any kind of drug is a really bad idea.
Yeah, and I really want to go back to that example you provided earlier because I think it's a great one. And I think a lot of parents might find themselves in that situation of having someone come pick up their kid and having the assumption that they may have been smoking weed. Maybe their eyes are red, maybe you smell it. There's a variety of reasons why you may feel that way. And so, yeah, I think if you can bring them in just to have a glass of water and just see if you can like talk to them for a bit and get a sense of things. And I would see if it's possible to get any other ride. You can ask them, but most likely a teenager is not going to feel comfortable telling a parent that they've used weed. The only situation I think they would is if you, and it's hard to do this, but have a really natural ability to seem unjudgmental or not judgmental at all, which if you're a parent, it's just always going to be assumed you kind of come from a more judgmental perspective, especially a 16-year-old's going to feel judged for using. So yeah, that's the hard part. But if they are really comfortable with you, they might be able to tell you honestly, and then you can get a good answer out of them. And if it's just you've got a gut feeling about it, then see if you can just say, "Hey, I'll order you a cab or a taxi,"
Or I'll drop you off. Yeah. Something, there are lots of safe options, but don't let your kid get in the car with someone you think is high. It is the bottom line because it's incredibly dangerous. A lot of the information we have as far as when people were high and they were involved in crash, a lot of the data comes from cadavers. It's not until something horrible happens and there are blood samples that we are able to accumulate some data.
yeah, you don't hear about cannabis impaired driving on the news very often. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it's not because it's not happening. It's definitely happening, and cannabis impaired driving is more pervasive than drinking and driving.
Yes, and that's another point is that when there is some smoking or vaping or whatever, and then combined with alcohol, it's not 1 plus 1 equals 2, it's 1 plus 1 equals 5 or 7. It's an exponential um, difference.
Yeah, so particularly for youth, they're going to consume them together because both are party drugs, both are social drugs, and so they'll often be consumed together. Some teens think that smoking weed reduces the effects of the alcohol because it makes them feel calmer. The alcohol gets them hyped up, and then the weed kind of slows them down until they feel more sober in their minds, which, of course, it's not more sober, it's just a different type of impairment, but they can't distinguish that.
So I guess a couple of things here. One is that you always want to make sure that there are options because even if someone goes, I mean, maybe my daughter gets picked up and she goes off to a party and the person taking her is the designated driver, but then something happens and someone offers that person a beer or they're in a room and they're passing around a joint and so in the end that designated driver is no longer sober to drive them home. I think the point there is that you always want to have a backup plan so that they have a safe way of getting home. And as you said earlier, Sylvia, it has to be kind of non judgmental. You can talk about it tomorrow, but if you're going to come down and pick them up and be yelling at everybody, I mean, that's it, they'll never call you again.
Yeah.
It's because how often do you hear like my parents would kill me?
Yeah. All the time. Yeah. Students, it's their biggest fear. And they'll do the riskiest things because they're afraid of being grounded. They'll take their life in their hands because they're afraid of their parents finding out that they've used. And I know it, is important to recognize between different cultures, the acceptability is going to differ, particularly for new immigrants where cannabis isn't legal. And unless they're coming from Uruguay, like it's not legal anywhere else really federally in the world. And so it makes sense that people aren't as informed to have conversations with their kids. Even in Canada, we have parents who didn't grow up, obviously in a generation with legalization as a teen, so they didn't have any of these conversations. It's not familiar for a lot of people. And I get that. And so that's where, us as the social service sector is trying to, come in and fill in those gaps to educate this generation so that we have with alcohol, right, where it used to be normal to drink and drive. And then there was so much stigma brought around and people are informed and the legal side of things came so hard on impaired driving. We don't have that issue of drinking and driving as much as we used to anymore. And we're trying to bring that same approach to cannabis. So right now it's pretty pervasive. We have a lot of youth. We have a lot of people being killed from cannabis impaired driving. I don't think the general public has any idea how serious of an issue it is. But we're trying to bring that, educational approach, because we have the legal side there. Legally, it's the exact same, regardless of whether you're on Percocet, ecstasy, cannabis, like no matter what drug you're consuming, medicinal or not, if you're impaired, you're impaired. That's the charge in Canada. So it's just the education piece we're trying to bring up.
Yeah, it's all about getting them home safely. And they will make mistakes. I mean, if you look back, I can think of a lot of mistakes I made. And sometimes, I mean, you'd be talking to friends, colleagues of your own generation and say, thank God we made it and we're alive. We all made big mistakes. The big problem is like not giving them an out, coming down so hard. And sometimes you're right, it's cultural. Even alcohol it can be cultural. Some religions, backgrounds, cultural backgrounds are not accepting of alcohol. And whether that's right or wrong, I mean, certainly it's wrong if they're underage, but right or wrong, it's most important to make sure that every time they go out, they come home safe. You can have the conversations afterwards, but they've got to come home safe. And it's making sure that that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think always including your own personal perspective to it as well. Sharing your own mistakes, bad decisions that you've made in the past can be really valuable for your kids, because you're trying to relate to them, right? And nobody's perfect. And I think we've all been teenagers before and made poor choices, but it's just trying to, exactly like you said, helping them get home safe.
But you don't want to normalize that. This is what I did, and I did the wrong thing. So it's not such a big deal if it's like really making sure that they understand that their safety is the most important thing. And I'm lucky to be alive based on hitchhiking and all kinds of crazy things we used to do. But you want to make sure that they understand what's safe and what's not, and that at the end of the day, their safety is the most important thing.
Yeah, there's like a story I share with some students about when I was in grade 12 and we were going up to a Wasaga Beach, I think it was, or up for our grade 12 graduation. And we were celebrating, and so we were leaving, and halfway through the drive, I realized that the driver was high. I felt like I didn't know what to do in that situation. The conversation of don't drive high was not around at all. It was just all about don't drink and drive. And we had alcohol in the back, but no one was drinking and driving. Anyways, and so knowing that the driver was high, it obviously is unsettling. And then the story had always been something with that really stuck with me as like a really poor decision that I made to continue being in that car and not switching or anything like that. And a few weeks later, I'd heard about a story which we actually use in the Weed Out the Risk program, which happened just north of Ottawa, where some kids were doing the exact same thing, going, out of town for a party, only cannabis in their system, no alcohol at all. And they got into a crash, and 5 of those boys in the various cars that were all driving up were killed. 5 boys. And then this was a very small town, Canada, I think 2 hours north of Ottawa. So you can imagine in a small town having 5 young men killed, how impactful that is. And I remember hearing that story and thinking like, this could have been me, and just how like I had made the exact same decision. So it's important to share the stories too. I know you don't want to like normalize it and whatnot. But at the same point, I think it's also valuable to share it. This in one story it can survive, in another and it's not. And it's natural as a teenager to always believe you're going to be on the safe side. You're going to be the person who survives. And that is how your brain is working right now as a teenager. You always think that way. Right. But the reality is not everyone is. So that's what I try and share with them. Honestly, I find like any real situations that provide some insight into why poor decisions were made and how you've learned from them can always help them, guide them in the real life of when they're making their decisions as well.
Yeah, one mistake can be so horrendous. And we need to empower them to be able to make those choices and, give them that safe ride home. I was talking to somebody for one of the other podcasts, and I said, and leave some money for an Uber. And of course they said, well, nobody uses money. But it's a credit card, some kind of way, an account that they can use to get home if they need to. Make sure that their friends get home too, when they go out. Because everybody can make a mistake. And then have the conversation the next day when everybody's calm, and you can talk through what happened and how you'll change it moving forward.
Teens' brains are designed to not think of the worst case scenario. They're designed to always think that they're going to be okay. So, for example, they think, oh, I've got a designated driver. I've planned my night. I'm going to be safe. And they don't think, well, what if that driver chooses to use, like you had mentioned before, which often happens. People go to a party and they think, well, I'll just have a little bit. I'll just have one beer. Well, when you don't have a graduated license, there is a zero tolerance. So you don't get that option. And having them think through those multiple ideas of how they can get home. So when they're leaving for the night, saying things like, great, you have a designated driver. I'm going to add my credit card on your, like the Uber app on your phone. So it's there if, for any reason it's needed. And I would suggest all parents to do that. Of course, I know the fear for parents is that it will be abused and whatnot. But at the end of the day, if it's kids getting home safe from a party, is it ever really being abused? I know you probably don't want to spend your money on getting other kids home, but think how much worse you would feel if that kid ended up being on the news that night because they were killed because they didn't make the right choice, right? So if your kid ends up being the one to offer them an Uber ride home and help them out, that's, I think, really what you should be focused on. And then also saying to them, like, do you know what bus would get you home? Like, it's the number 3 that you'll just take up on this street. It stops at 11:30. So you're going to have to, it comes every 15 minutes. So just make sure you grab that bus.
I think that's a great idea. But talking about that beforehand, so they have a backup plan if they need it. And they know what the rules are. I mean, nothing worse to getting to that bus stop at 12 o'clock and the last bus is gone. Now they're really stranded. So, kind of going through some of those things so they know what the options are beforehand. I think that's a great idea.
And students will think, okay, I'll just do it when I'm there, when I'm at the party. Like, I have Google Maps, Mom. Like, I don't need to plan ahead because we have the internet now, right? But maybe you consumed weed that's really strong. Like, maybe you're just like too high to like deal with your phone and you just want to know, right? So having that conversation just can't hurt.
Yeah, it's like we have the internet now. I've heard that before. Yeah. Another area that I wanted to talk a little bit about is gummies.
Yeah.
And because gummies are different, it's not, they take a long time to work. And that's where you kind of can even get into overdoses because people think they're like candy and I don't feel anything. So I'll just have a few more. And they can be pretty intense.
Yeah. So 3 key things I always say to know about edibles. Number 1, they're delayed onset. So they take half an hour up to 2 hours to activate. For someone who smokes weed and then tries an edible for the first time, they might be expecting the same thing, which is they'd be high right away. And that's not the case. So then they're thinking, oh, it doesn't work, and they'll consume more and more, right? So that's super dangerous. If they don't know, there is a delayed onset. Number 2 is the potency, completely different potency than cannabis that someone would smoke, but also it's in the form of something delicious or attractive, right? Brownies, cookies. It can be basically in anything. Now it's like beer and soda water. And it would be consumed in abnormally small amounts. And so this is where you always want to be purchasing legal if you're consuming, and so you know what you're getting. But people often would eat, like, let's say a whole cookie, right, after dinner or something. And with an edible, a person might have a small bite, and that could get them pretty messed up. So abnormally small amounts should be consumed with edibles. And then finally, the duration of impairment is a whole lot longer. So if someone smokes weed, the effects will generally wear off after a number of hours. I do say that if they're not consuming in abundance, let's say they smoked Friday night, generally speaking, they would be not impaired Saturday morning to drive home. generally. Now, it might still be in their system in a legal perspective, and so that's a risk that they'd be taking, but they generally wouldn't be impaired. Now, it's different with edibles. With an edible, you are likely going to wake up and still be impaired because it can affect you for up to 24 hours, depending on how much of it you've consumed.
And while we're talking about this, I mean, there's also the concern with where supplies is what I'm thinking of, and being cut with other drugs or even insecticides or other. I mean, I've heard of weed being, I don't know the terminology, but with even fentanyl. Um, so there's that too.
Okay, so teenagers always think that when they're getting weed from a friend, and their friend will say, "This is the best weed. I use this dealer all the time. They're fantastic. They're great. It'll give you the best high," and they'll hype it up. I don't think people realize when they're buying weed off the street that that's exactly how every single drug is sold. Like, everyone does that. Everyone hypes it up. So it's not special if someone tries to hype it up to you. And next, they think, well, there's no way anyone would waste fentanyl or cocaine or an expensive illicit drug on weed, on a cheap drug like that. And so it couldn't possibly be mixed. And there's two ways that weed does get laced. Actually, I'm going to say three. There's three ways that you can have laced weed, and it can be really dangerous. So number one is there are dealers who will spray chemicals on weed. So that can be like Windex, and that will make it heavier so they can sell less for more profit. Now, in all honesty, it's pretty rare, but it can happen. And when you're buying from the illegal sector, this is what happens. So this is why legalization, like one of the big reasons why legalization happened is to try and reduce the purchasing that's going on from the illegal market. So intentionally. The second way is non-intentional. So let's say you have a dealer who sells cocaine, and cocaine is commonly mixed with fentanyl. So a dealer's mixing and they use a credit.
Sorry, repeat that.
So
cocaine is commonly mixed with fentanyl?
Yeah, it can have a small amount of it. Yeah. A whole bunch of street drugs, but like the reason why so many people have been killed by fentanyl is often cases they're not even just consuming fentanyl, they're consuming other drugs that ended up having fentanyl in it. Now, fentanyl is so potent that enough as a grain of salt could kill someone. That's how strong it is. There's never been a drug so potent before. And so you have a dealer, let's say they're using a credit card to chop up the powder and a scale, and they're doing that, and they give the cocaine that's got a little bit of fentanyl to this person who's buying that. Okay, now it's time for your weed, and they're using the same credit card, the same scale and tools to put it together, and they haven't properly Lysoled it or cleaned it or anything like that. They're not a licensed distributor. There's no one regulating them and telling them what to do. And so now you can have cross-contamination. The dealer had no intention of getting that cross-contamination or small amounts of it, but that's how it can happen. If you're getting it from a dealer who sells other things, that's where it becomes really risky. This is why I say with you, who are wanting to experiment with weed, go to the legal market. It's always just going to be safer. And I know that, I can't tell kids to smoke weed or anything like that, but that's the harm reduction approach. If you're going to choose to use where you can see the label, you know how much you're consuming, you know what's in it. And that way you don't have to worry about things. And then what you were saying about pesticides, I mean, yeah, it is a plant. It can have all sorts of different things on it. Students always say it's natural, it can't be bad. Well, it's a carcinogen. I mean, you're burning it and inhaling it. It's not going to be great for your lungs. And yeah, it's similar concerns you would have, like how it's washed and things like that, as you would with your fruit and vegetables that you eat.
So I think that some of what we're talking about is a little controversial here. So I want to just kind of, my perspective on this is, it's like sex. It's like, just don't do it. Doesn't work. So having conversations around it, I would never encourage somebody to drink underage. I wouldn't encourage anyone underage to smoke or do any kind of drug. However, it is about harm reduction, and it's about making sure that at the end of the day they get home safe. So yeah, we have to have some of the stern conversations, but we also have to get the information out there so people can make good choices. And I agree with you when it comes to cannabis that it's better from a licensed supplier that ensures that there isn't cross contamination or pesticides or Windex to add to the weight, um, rather than some of these other products. But their friends aren't going to tell them that, and their friends may not even know.
No, and the thing is, their friends are always going to hype things up, and that's just the way that everyone works. Is that they always just want to say, "Oh, this is the greatest, this is the best," and they'll also say like, "This weed just like made me laugh for hours," or "It was like a really good time." Where weed affects people very differently as well. Some people will just be super anxious or sleepy. Like no one can tell you what exactly the effect is going to be of that weed. Like there's strains that can have a tendency in certain directions, but generally speaking, everyone's so different that they're going to have different interactions with it. And then one thing I forgot to mention on the last topic, a previous topic of lacing, is the last way that it can be laced is, I don't know if this really falls into the category of lacing, but cannabis that's like artificially made. So that's called K2 or spice, and it looks like weed, smells like weed, and is not, and can be much more harmful. There have been kids who have died from this. I think in 2018, there was a kid in Melton who died from spice. So it does happen. Again, it's not the most common thing. It's not, killing people the way impaired driving is, but it is something to still be aware of, and, open that conversation with your kid because they might.
If it's artificial, like what is it's not like, is it plant-based?
You know what? I honestly don't know too much about it to even comment. But I think it's just basically a plant based substance that's got the chemicals in it, like added to it, like THC, but then like other things as well. And because it's artificial, it can be risky and how it affects people.
So another conversation to have is like, do you really know what you're smoking? I guess we have to get back to alcohol or impairment when it comes to driving. But there's just so much to know. And just as parents, we need to ask a whole lot of questions. When you were talking earlier, I was thinking in that situation with somebody coming to the door to get my daughter, I don't know how often like somebody beeps a horn and out they go. Um, I think that really everybody should come to the door, and not only just because it's polite, but so you get a look at the driver and can ask them a few questions. How long have they been driving? What's their driving record like? I don't know. And just kind of get a sense whether or not they are completely sober, or they're going to get around the corner and be doing 150 kilometers an hour through the neighborhood. You just don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, as a parent, there's so little you can do at the front door because at the end of the day, like if your kid really wants to just run out, they will. So it can be hard, and I think the most power, the area where you really have the most power, is providing them with the education and motivation to advocate for their own safety. Because at the end of the day, the driver is going to do whatever they're going to do, and if your kid is prepared enough, and informed enough, they can stand up and take action. But being a parent of a teenager, you don't have much control, and that's, I think, the hardest thing for parents to grapple with.
Yeah, and although they do have a lot of control when it comes to the car, because not somebody else driving, but for their own teens, when they're driving, and there's big power in being able to take those keys away. So I think that families need rules, and this is not something I would have thought about, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So it's about sharing information and letting parents do what's right for their own family, but from at least a knowledge, a base of knowledge.
I know another strategy that parents can use as well is there's like CAA. I guess if you're in Ontario, but insurance companies have that black box that you can put in your car, and it can track your speed, like if you've been speeding and how you're driving and whatnot. So this is another way that parents can kind of regulate the other drivers in the car, to see if they can be trusted. But I agree. I think that driving is such a privilege, and people don't really realize how much responsibility you're taking on, because I think teens have just been waiting for so long for that level of freedom to go wherever they want. And it's so exciting. And I get it. Like, they haven't been allowed to do this thing that they really want to do. And it's just so exciting. And it's easy for that to get carried away. But obviously, if they're showing signs of being irresponsible or making poor choices, I think it's the first thing that should go in a consequence, because that's where you need to uphold the highest amount of responsibility is in the car.
And when it comes right down to it, parents are the ones who have the most to lose.
Yeah, absolutely. Another good thing for parents to know too, when you have someone picking up your kid, is that the passenger seat is the most dangerous. The passenger is the one who's most likely to be killed or to be seriously injured. So a lot of teens will think, well, the driver's high, but I'm not, and I'll be an extra set of eyes on the road. I'll kind of watch out for things and make sure they're driving okay. It doesn't work like that. You're the one who's most likely to be affected. So, just thinking about that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And the more passengers in the car, the harder it gets too. There's more distraction. That's another.
Yeah, that is statistically one of the most dangerous things when it comes to a car. The more people that are in the car, the rate of crashes exponentially increases. So that's something for parents to really keep in mind. Is it's one thing if you're kind of nervous or thinking about who's this person taking my kid for the night, but then also if there's like 4 other people in the car, like, you better trust that driver. Really think much more critically about that driver, because that's when things get riskier.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Sylvia. I think you've certainly shed a lot of light on things and raised a lot of questions that parents need to be asking. But it's up to every family to make their own choices. And, it's sharing information is a good way to start people thinking about things that perhaps they hadn't considered. And this is an area where young people have a lot of misinformation. And the problem with that is that they tell it to each other over and over and over, so that everybody believes the same stuff, and it's just not true. So sharing some of that, the truth about drugs and driving is an important thing too. Now, one last thing just before we go, and I don't know if you're prepared to talk about this or not, but is other drugs that are perhaps prescription drugs, and how they affect driving.
It's honestly a pretty simple process. Any prescription drug will say on the label, do not operate heavy machinery or drive when consuming this. Your doctor will tell you, but don't rely on your doctor. Just read the label. Labels will always tell you if it has an impairing effect. And if you're not sure, you can always just Google it or call the distributor or the pharmacy, and they can offer that advice to you as well.
Yeah, because it could even be as simple as like a heavy allergy medication or something like that can make you very drowsy. And if you're already tired to begin with, then that can be dangerous too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. And I will direct any questions that we get on this topic from you. I'm sure there'll be a few. Thank you so much, Sylvia.
Take care. Thank you.
Take care. Before You Hand Over the Keys was brought to you by Teens Learn to Drive. Check out our website at teenslearntodrive.com for more information, videos, and resources.